Hello and welcome. Let's get started by recording a simple macro that applies several different formatting options to the currently selected cells. First, go to the View tab on the ribbon, click the Macros drop-down, and choose Record Macro. This opens the Record Macro dialog box. Here, give a macro a name. The name must not contain spaces or special characters. You can use underscores if needed. The name is the only required field. If you like, you can also assign a keyboard shortcut, which lets you run the macro instantly without using the ribbon. This can make your work faster and more efficient. You can also choose where to store the macro. In the Store Macro in drop-down, select this workbook if you want to save the macro in your current file. Choose New Workbook if you want to record the macro in a new file. Or select Personal Macro Workbook if you want the macro to be available globally, so it works in any workbook you open. For this tutorial, we'll keep the default option, which is this workbook. You can also write a short description of the macro to help explain what it does. Now, click OK to begin recording. Excel is now recording your actions. You can confirm this by looking at the bottom left corner of the window. You'll see a small square icon in the status bar. Hovering over it shows the message. A macro is currently recording. Click to stop recording. Let's record some cell formatting steps. We won't type anything or change the cell selection. We'll simply format the cell that's already selected. Since we're now recording a macro, every action we take will be recorded, including any cell selection changes. So it's important to stay on the current cell. Now go to the Home tab, and in the Font group, apply a fill color, for example, brown. Then change the font color to white. Select a different font style. And finally, apply borders. Let's go with all borders. Once you've finished applying the formatting, go back to the View tab, open the Macros drop-down, and click Stop Recording. Your macro has now been recorded. Every action you performed, from formatting to styling, has been saved. To use the macro, first select a different set of cells. Then go to the View tab, click on Macros, and choose View Macros. Select your macro from the list and click Run. You'll see that Excel instantly applies the same formatting you recorded. Try running the macro on other cell selections to see it in action. It will always repeat the exact steps you recorded. This kind of macro is especially useful when you want to apply the same set of formatting actions over and over. Instead of repeating those steps manually, you can simply select the cells and run the macro. It saves you time and keeps your formatting consistent. Let's create another macro. Unlike the previous one, where we only formatted the selected cell, this time we'll enter text into cells, move the selection, and apply formatting. For this example, we'll create a simple weekly sales report that includes 3 columns: day, date, and sale, just like what you see on the screen. Each time we run this macro, it will automatically generate the days and corresponding dates. The sale column will stay empty, so it can be filled in manually later. Let's begin by recording the macro. Go to the View tab, click the Macros drop-down, and choose Record Macro. Enter a name for your macro, then click OK to start recording. By default, cell A1 is selected. In cell A1, type day. In B1, type date. In C1, type sale. Now, in cell B2, enter today's date, then use the fill handle to drag this formula down to B8, filling the next 7 days. Next, go to cell A2 and enter the formula shown on screen. This extracts the day name from the date in cell B2. Now, double-click the fill handle on A2. This automatically fills down the formula to match the entries in column B. To finish the table, select the header row and apply bold formatting. Once done, go back to the View tab, click the Macros drop-down, and choose Stop Recording. Your macro is now ready. Let's test it. Open a new worksheet and run the macro. You'll see that it recreates the entire sales table exactly as recorded. Try again on another new sheet. The macro writes the table starting from cell A1 to C8, just like before. Now, let's try something different. Select cell G6 and run the macro again. You'll notice that only the word day appears in cell G6, and nothing else is created. Why did that happen? Well, by default, Excel macros record with absolute references. They store exact cell locations like A1, B2, etc. So if the macro recorded all actions starting from A1, and you move the selection to G6, only the very first step, typing day, tries to run at G6, while the rest still target the originally recorded locations. Let's do one more test. Open a new sheet, select cell I7, and run the macro. This time, you'll see the word day appears in cell I7, but the rest of the table is written again in A1 to C8, just like before. Why is this happening? By default, Excel records macros using absolute references. This means it not only records your actions, but also the exact cell locations where those actions occurred, including any selections made using the mouse or keyboard. So, when we recorded the macro, we typed day into cell A1 without changing the selection, which is why day appears in the currently selected cell when the macro runs. However, when we enter the date, we manually selected cell B2. That change in selection was also recorded, along with every other cell movement and action. As a result, each time you run the macro, Excel repeats not just what you did, but where you did it, jumping to those exact cells. If you want the macro to work based on your current selection, rather than fixed cell positions, you can enable the Use Relative References option before starting the recording. This way, the macro adapts to wherever your ActiveCell is when it's run. To enable the use of relative references, go to the View tab, click the Macros dropdown, and select Use Relative References. From this point on, Excel will record your actions using relative references instead of absolute ones. Let's start recording the macro. This time, we'll name it Relative Ref. We'll repeat the same steps as in the previous macro named Brain Bell, but now everything will be recorded relative to the current selection. First, we create the header row, starting from cell A1. Type day in A1, date in B1, and sale in C1. Then, in cell B2, enter the formula today. This function returns the current date. However, since it's a volatile function, it will update every time Excel recalculates, which is not what we want. To prevent that, we right-click on cell B2, choose Copy, then right-click again and choose Paste Values. This converts the dynamic formula result into a static date. All these steps are now being recorded in the macro, including entering the today function and replacing it with a fixed value. Notice that we didn't just type today's date manually. Instead, we used the today function first and then replaced it with its result. This method ensures that each time the macro runs, it captures the current system date and then freezes it. So the table always starts from the day the macro is run, but won't change afterward. Next, use the fill handle to drag the date down from B2 to B8, filling 7 consecutive dates. Now in cell A2, enter the text formula as shown on screen to extract the day of the week. Then, double-click the fill handle to automatically fill the day column down to A8. Finally, select the header row and make the text bold. Now go to the View tab, click the Macros dropdown, and choose Stop Recording. That's it. We've recorded a macro using relative references. From now on, whenever you run this macro, it will insert the sales table starting from the cell you currently have selected. The macro adapts to your selection, making it flexible and easy to use anywhere in your worksheet. Try selecting different cells and run the macro again. You'll notice that the entire table adjusts its starting position based on where your selection is. That's the power of using relative references. Earlier, I mentioned that we used the today function while recording this macro and then converted it to a static value. Let's see why that's useful. Go to your system's date settings and change the date to February 4th, 2024, or you can choose any past or future date. Then, come back to Excel. When I run the relative ref macro, it creates the sales table starting from February 4th, 2024, all the way to February 10th. That's because Excel reads the date from your operating system. Now, if I run the previous macro named Brain Bell, you'll see it always creates the same date range, from May 14th, 2025 to May 20th, 2025. That's because, during recording, we manually typed the date using the keyboard shortcut Control semicolon. So the date was fixed and doesn't change with the system date. In contrast, the relative ref macro is more dynamic. It uses the current date each time it's run and also adapts the starting location based on your current selection. When you record a macro, every action you take, whether it's selecting a cell, formatting, or entering text, is actually written as VBA code in a subroutine. The name you give your macro becomes the name of that subroutine. So in fact, macros are just VBA subroutines behind the scenes. Now let's see how we can create and manage macros directly using VBA. First, we'll open the VBA editor. If the Developer tab isn't already visible on your ribbon, right-click anywhere on the ribbon and choose Customize the ribbon. This opens the Excel Options dialog box. On the right-hand side, check the box for Developer and click OK. Now the Developer tab should appear on your ribbon. Go to the Developer tab and click on the Visual Basic button to open the Visual Basic Editor. On the right side of the editor window, you'll see the Project Explorer. Expand the Modules folder by clicking the plus sign. Excel stores each macro inside a separate module. Since we created only one macro in this workbook, you'll see a single module listed, Module 1. Keep in mind, we created another macro earlier in a different workbook, which is currently closed, so that one doesn't appear here. Double-click on Module 1 to open its code window. Here's what the macro looks like in VBA. This code shows exactly what Excel recorded when we created the macro. Typing text into cells, applying formulas, using autofill, selecting ranges, and formatting columns. Each step is laid out as VBA code that runs when you execute the macro. This macro uses absolute references. Don't confuse this with Excel's absolute references that use $signs like $A, $1. In VBA, cell references like A1, B1, or C5 are also considered absolute when used in recorded macros, because they always point to a fixed location on a sheet. Let's take a look at the code of the macro that uses relative references. You'll notice that it uses the offset method along with the ActiveCell property to select, enter, or format data. The offset method is what makes the macro use relative references. It moves the selection relative to the current active cell. For example, offset method having first argument 0 and second one means stay on the same row but move one column to the right. This allows the macro to adapt to wherever you started, instead of always targeting fixed cells like A1 or B1. So, when a macro begins at a different cell, the same series of offset instructions will build the table in the correct position relative to that starting point. Now let's create the macro using VBA. We'll start by modifying the Brain Bell macro, which originally used absolute references. Step by step, we'll replace the existing code with a cleaner and more flexible version that uses relative references. As we go, we'll remove the old lines so the final code is shorter and easier to understand. First, we declare a variable named cell and assign it the current active cell as shown on screen. This means that wherever the active cell is when we run the macro, that cell will be stored in the variable cell, and everything else we do will be relative to this starting point. Next, we use just one line to insert all three column headings, date, and sale. Here, Resize method creates a range that's 1 row tall and 3 columns wide, and the array function fills each cell in that range with our headings. Then, we bold the heading row. And that's it. We've added and formatted all the headers using only 2 lines of code. Now, delete the old 8 lines that did the same thing, one cell at a time. Also, delete the old line that bolds the headings. It's at the end because that was the last step recorded. We've already done it using the Resize function, so that line is no longer needed. Next, we insert today's date in the cell just below the date heading. This uses the offset method to move 1 row down and 1 column right from the starting cell. The date function returns today's date dynamically. To fill the rest of the week, we use autofill to copy the date down for 7 rows, automatically increasing each by 1 day. The autofill method copies that date, increasing it by 1 day, into a range of 7 cells using the Resize method. In short, the offset function defines the starting cell, and the Resize function defines the size of the range we want to fill. Then we make sure the column is wide enough to display all the dates. This prevents Excel from showing hash symbols when the date doesn't fit in the cell. Now remove the old code that inserted a fixed date manually. That version always used a hard-coded date. Our new code uses the date function, so it's dynamic. It always shows the current date when a macro runs. Next, we insert a formula to extract the weekday name from each date. This line places the Formula 1 column to the left of the date column. The formula uses the text function to convert the date into a day name, like Monday or Tuesday. To fill that formula down for the rest of the week, we use the fill down method along with offset and resize. That copies the formula into 7 rows, 1 for each day. Now remove the old lines that inserted each formula individually. We've replaced them with just 2 lines of efficient code. Finally, we adjust the column width of the day names. And that's it. Our new macro is much cleaner, uses relative references, and is dynamic. Every time you run it, it updates based on where you start, and what day it is. With this new version of the macro, you've replaced bulky, rigid code with a much cleaner and more dynamic version using relative references. The result is not only easier to read, but also more adaptable to wherever you run the macro on the sheet. So, here are the 3 versions of the macro. The first one, that's our code, is simple, clean, and easy to follow. The second one uses absolute references, and the third uses relative references, but both are longer and more cluttered. Our version, shown in bullet point 1, is much neater and way easier to work with. Hope you liked the tutorial. Thanks for watching.